The European elections this Thursday were not supposed to happen, and polls show a public lashing out at the two major parties. The Conservatives sit at around 9 to 12%, which would be their worst result ever. The Brexit Party is miles ahead after launching just over a month ago, and it seems possible Labour could be overtaken by the Liberal Democrats, risen like zombies from their austerity-induced death. But do these elections represent a genuine realignment of British politics or just a chaotic and short-term blip? To make sense of these tumultuous times, I'm extremely lucky to be joined by the one and the only Sir John Curtice. Thank you for joining us at Navarra Media today.
Not at all.
John needs no introduction. He's Professor of Politics. Well, I'm going to give him one anyway. He's Professor of Politics at the University of Strathclyde, famous for donning BBC screens at every election for the last 4 decades. His exit polls called the last 4 general elections entirely correctly, and he's gained a lively cult following online, including a dedicated Twitter account. Is Sir John Curtice on TV? Hopefully, they've clocked that he is on TV right now.
Or not?
I'd like to think so.
Oh, right,
Why
okay.
not?
We'll see what the Twitterati make of it.
How are you doing? Are you gearing up for a Thursday night on the BBC?
No, it's Sunday night because with the European elections, nobody is allowed to count until the last polls have closed anywhere in the EU 28. So we have this hiatus between the Thursday on which we hold our election together with the Netherlands and 10 p.m. Central European time on Sunday, which is when the polls close in the last countries, most of whom, of course, will vote on Sunday.
So you're not allowed to do an exit poll?
Well, can't afford an exit poll apart from anything else. But actually, somebody discovered today, actually, and I wasn't aware of this, actually, you cannot publish an exit poll in the UK until 9 o'clock UK time on Sunday. So even if you do one on Thursday, you have to hang on to it because apparently the law in general, you cannot report how people have voted in an election until the polls have closed in the UK. But apparently, we have extended that rule for European Parliament elections until the last poll has closed anywhere inside the European Union. It's nice to know, doubtless those who are of a leave disposition will say, well, that's terrible and we should be allowed to tell the result on Friday morning. But there we go.
Because I suppose otherwise the danger is that people see how we voted and that influences their vote.
If anybody
in
thought
future.
that how we're going to vote is going to make a slightest bit of difference to anybody in Malta and Lithuania, yes, maybe.
All right, let's get straight to the point. What is going to be the big story at these elections? What headlines do you imagine? Who's going to be the big winners?
Well,
the big losers?
There looks like to be one big headline, and that is that the Brexit Party looks as though it's going to come first and probably will do better than UKIP did back in 2014. We should remember UKIP did win the 2014 European elections. UKIP got 27% of the vote on that occasion. On average, the polls at the moment put the Brexit Party at 32, and they all pretty much put them above 30. So a fairly good chance that the Brexit Party is going to do better than UKIP did under Nigel Farage's leadership as well 5 years ago. Why? Well, it's not very complicated. Essentially, the Brexit vote is a leave vote. It is a vote of those who think that we should leave the European Union without a deal. It's about 80% of that group voting for the Brexit Party. And we know around between a half and 2/3 of Leave voters are of that view. And of course, what they above all expected to happen on March the 29th is that we left the European Union. So basically, there's just a very, very heavy defection away from the Conservative Party towards the Brexit Party amongst those who voted Leave, which is the vast bulk of the Conservative voters, because the government has failed to deliver. So basically saying you failed to deliver, you should have just got out, and they're attracted back by Nigel Farage. And we should remember that probably quite a lot of these people voted for UKIP in 2014 and or 2015, and that essentially what's going on, at least in part, is that remember that squeeze on the UKIP vote following the 2016 referendum, and then certainly on the announcement of the 2017 general election, most of it in the direction of the Conservatives. Basically, that squeeze has been fully reversed and probably a bit more, and therefore, as a result, we have again a substantial Eurosceptic party. So that's the big headline number one. Big headline number two then is that it looks as though perhaps Conservative and Labour between them won't get much more than a third of the vote. That will be the lowest ever. The Conservatives certainly look as though they're going to do very badly indeed. The polls on average put them at 12%. Labour Party not in quite such a pickle. On average, the polls that put them at 22% But that's the one area where there is disagreement in the polls. So I can find you polls that have Labour Party as low as 15, one or two of which have the Liberal Democrats ahead of them, but rather more have them in the low 20s. And on average, the Liberal Democrats are still about 7 points behind. But that said, like the Conservatives, the Labour vote has declined during the course of the European Parliament election campaign. And that is a decline on top of a decline that was going on during the course of the Brexit impasse ever since last mid-November, when the Brexit deal was first unveiled. It's in the case, whereas the case of Conservatives, it's predominantly, though not wholly, amongst Leave voters. In the case of Labour, it's amongst both Remainers and amongst Leavers, though probably raw amongst Remainers. And certainly one thing that's happened in the last 3 or 4 weeks or so is that whereas the Labour Party was hanging on to the support of around 40% of Remainers, now that's more like 30%, and it's the Liberal Democrats who look like the principal beneficiary. So there's a bit of a battle there, but certainly if one were to say that the Conservative Party has been washed offshore and completely away by a tsunami, in the case of the Labour Party, its votes being eroded by a steady stream of water rather than being completely overwhelmed. And that extent, at least at the moment, the Labour Party is perhaps still the single most popular party amongst Remain voters, though perhaps according to some polls only just.
And does any of this matter? So I think the two major parties aren't performing particularly well in these polls. It seems like definitely in the Conservative Party, but to some extent in the Labour Party, there is a decision at the top potentially to say, let's just try and downplay these. These are basically sort of like a Twitter poll. They're just the public lashing out at the government. So let's not invest them with too much significance. Do you think that's a mistake that they haven't really fought these with all their...
There's a short-term and a long-term answer to that question. I suspect that it is the case that if the Conservatives were not doing as badly in the polls as they are at present, that the Prime Minister's a final attempt earlier today to try and get her EU withdrawal treaty through by essentially making concessions both to the ERG and to the Labour Party might have got a somewhat warmer reception, or at least a less immediately hostile reception than it seems to have done. I think certainly the interpretation of those on the ERG side of the argument, the hard Brexiteers, is that the success of Nigel Farage, the Brexit Party that's anticipated, means that the Conservative Party needs to steer in the direction of basically a hard Brexit stroke, a leaving without a deal, and that certainly anything that they would wish to regard as Brexit in name only is not to be supported, and that certainly includes Mrs May's deal, and even more so now that this deal might retain some notion of a customs union, at least for a while, and even opens up the prospect that maybe the House of Commons could vote for a second EU referendum. So against that, but I think certainly these results have not helped, and certainly the decline of Conservative support has helped to hasten Mrs May's departure. The pressure on her from the 1922 committee, again, is a product, frankly, of Tory MPs going, hang on, what's going to happen to my seat if this carries on? So I certainly, the future of the Prime Minister, the future of her Brexit deal is probably being influenced by what's happened already, supposedly, according to the polls. On the Labour side, well, I'm not quite sure that it's going to have any immediate impact, except that certainly those who are of a more Remain disposition will probably say, well, that was a good idea talking to the government for 5 weeks. It helped to ensure that we perhaps a little bit got tarred with their brush, and that didn't do us any good amongst Remainers, though equally Leave supporters will say, well, look, this just goes to show the threat of Nigel Farage, and we cannot afford to respect the referendum. So I expect on the Labour side, both sides will interpret the results in line with their prior predispositions. But that said, it will, it should make the Labour Party aware that while it may be the case that its compromise strategy means that it's not particularly heavily losing ground amongst Remainers or particularly heavily losing ground amongst Leavers, it doesn't mean that it's not losing ground. It's losing ground amongst both groups, seemingly because neither group is satisfied. So that's the short term. The long term is perhaps the interesting thing, however, is whether or not the kinds of results that we're going to see on Thursday could be replicated in the Westminster election. Now, they certainly won't be replicated in full. We know that European elections are different. Indeed, they create just the perfect environment for the anti-big two-party voting that we're expecting to see. We know that voters think that the elections are less important, that as a result they're quite willing to use them as a protest vote against the government. They're more willing to vote for smaller parties, and often if there's a decent Eurosceptic challenge, they'll vote for a Eurosceptic party. And this is not unique to the United Kingdom, it's not unique to this election. This is a long-standing feature of European elections. But as you can see, it's an environment in which the Conservatives' difficulties and Brexit's apparent success, it's just perfect. That said, if we look at the Westminster Pulse, the Brexit Party isn't running at 32, but it's running at about 19 on average. The Conservative and Labour parties in general are running only at about 50% together, with Labour narrowly ahead. That's the lowest level it's been in the opinion poll since 1981, at the height of the SDP Liberal Alliance. And so you can certainly see that there's something of a wash into immediate Westminster voting intentions. Now, that said, that's not unusual in the sense that if we look at previous European elections, you will see a similar wash. So when UKIP were doing well in 2014, then people kept on saying during that election campaign, oh yeah, I'll vote for UKIP in the Westminster election. Well, then of course the summer comes, everybody enjoys the sunshine. The European Parliament is not exactly the most high profile of institutions, and as a result people forget about it and we kind of revert back to the status quo ante. But of course, Europe is not going to melt away in the height of the summer sun. Rather, it may sizzle and fry even more strongly, not least because we're probably going to be facing a Conservative leadership election in which Brexit is going to be the central issue. And that therefore, perhaps we cannot assume that the change in party support is going to be reversed. And the other reason for saying that is this, that actually the decline in both Conservative and Labour support predates this election campaign. You could see, if you trace the polls between November and March the 29th, both the Conservatives and the Labour Party were already losing support in much the same way as they are now very clearly doing so. And during that period, support for UKIP went up from virtually nothing to 7, 8, 9%. So the signs were already there, irrespective of the European Parliament election. So I'm not sure we're going to go back to point zero. Now, implications of that, well, I'll give you a couple. One is that it's probably not going to be possible for a new Conservative Prime Minister to engineer a general election in the autumn in the confident assurance that they can now get a larger majority in the House of Commons and can be liberated from the tyranny of the divisions inside the Commons in the way that Theresa May has been a prisoner of. I suspect it is now the case that the Conservative Party will not be able to recover more than modestly in the polls unless and until they deliver Brexit, because these are the voters they have lost are voters who voted for the Conservative Party in the belief that the party was able and would deliver Brexit. Having failed to do so, they've gone back to the Eurosceptic party and, as it were, affirming the true faith. And in a sense, they now regard voting in that way as the best way of putting pressure on the government to follow their track. So that it probably changes the calculations and the position of a future Conservative Prime Minister. The second potential long-term effect is this. Remember that the glue that above all keeps our political parties together is the glue of maintaining an MP's career. And the biggest barrier to MPs defecting is the thought that they may lose their seat as a result. If the Conservative and Labour parties continue to be seriously weak in the polls through to the autumn, that glue will begin to unstick. And we know that both parties are seriously internally divided. And we also know that Change UK are certainly have a door open, says, please come here. We'd be delighted for you to come and join us, as indeed, frankly, with the Liberal Democrats. And so, therefore, given that we may discover that, partly as a result of events, that, MPs who at the moment are hanging on to their party by their fingertips may go, well, hang on, actually, I'm not going to hang on to my seat anyway, by looks like it. So I might try my luck with somebody else. So I think be aware, therefore, ironically, that managing the House of Commons could become more difficult in the wake of these election results. Certainly if the erosion of Conservative Labour support is confirmed and continues.
So one of the things you mentioned was that for the Labour Party, there'll be people from both factions saying that the election results, whatever they are, confirm their prejudices, as it were. So you have the people who want a people's vote, the people who will remain, who say the problem in these elections was that people defected to the Liberal Democrats and defected to the Greens, and therefore we need to support a people's vote. And there'll be others who say Brexit's destroying us, we need to get it over with. And potentially...
And the problem is they're both right.
So that's what I was going to ask you. So you're someone who can stand back with a somewhat more objective view. You don't seem to have much skin in the game of whether a referendum happens or not.
The answer is, if you use as your criterion what's happening to the 2017 Labour vote and what are the flows as so far as the European election is concerned, well, basically around 40% of those people who 27 Labour voters who voted Leave look as though they've switched to the Brexit Party. But of course, that transfer rate is less than the Conservative side. The Conservatives losing perhaps 70-75% of their Leave voters. But Labour Party are losing some. But of course, the Leave voters are a much smaller group for the Labour Party than our Remain voters. On the Remain side, the loss may be slightly higher, 40-45% of that vote. But because it's a bigger vote, it potentially has a bigger impact and it constitutes a greater proportion of the Labour vote. So there is no doubt that the Labour Party does face this situation whereby it would like to keep both groups on board, because without both groups it probably is going to be more difficult to win a general election. That said, what is also clear is that if the Labour Party is forced to choose, then it always makes more sense to choose the Remain side than the Leave side of the argument, because there are more Leave voters in its camp. And as a result of the fact that there is now something of a partial revival of the Liberal Democrats, a vote that, frankly, if you kind of were standing at it from Mars, but with an understanding of the broad patterns of voting behaviour, would say that looks like a Liberal Democrat vote. The Labour's vote in 2017 and the votes that it gained in 2017 looked very much like a classic Liberal Democrat vote. You need to be aware that there has long been obviously a potential risk that the Labour Party could lose votes in that direction. Now, at the moment, it's not anything like as serious for the Conservative Party, but you can see it going on there. And in the context of the European Parliament election, at least, the Liberal Democrats are at least enjoying a modicum of recovery as a result.
I mean, the argument that's going on in the Labour Party at the moment is the Remainers seem to be saying, and it sounds like you agree, that the best chance of getting a maximum vote share at the next general election is to just say, come on, we'll be the party of Remain, because there are more votes for Labour to win than if they were to go for the Leave side, and the constructive ambiguity policy is becoming less and less constructive.
Well, let me come at it slightly differently. What both the Conservatives and the Labour Party, and now very clearly the Prime Minister, have been trying to do is to find a compromise position on Brexit. And in both cases, it's essentially said, we think we should leave given the result, but then in the case of Theresa May, well, we at least need to acknowledge the economic concerns of Remainers by trying to go for as close as possible relationship, given we don't, according to her view, we don't want to be in the single market and we don't want freedom of movement. And on the Labour side, saying, well, equally actually not really willing to sign up to freedom of movement, but wanting, as it were, an even closer relationship, though whether it's attainable perhaps is another matter. So both of them have been going for a compromise. The problem is this. Whereas typically politicians are told to seek the centre ground of politics because that's where the voters are, this is an issue on where the voters do not occupy the centre ground. The two single most popular options amongst the public are leaving without a deal, or having a second referendum stroke revoking Article 50 in the expectation that we will change our minds. And the options in between, well, sometimes you can get people to say I'll put up with them, but relatively speaking, they're not very popular. That's certainly true of Mrs May's deal, which has been rejected by Remainers and Leavers. And Norway, somewhere there or abouts, kind of option, which we might describe Labour as being, Remainers will kind of say, well, it's okay, but it's not their first choice. And when you ask people to choose between leaving without a deal, having a second referendum, and a Norway-style option, the Norway-style option ends up looking no more popular than Mrs May's deal. So the compromise ground is not very well occupied. And therefore, as a result, it's very difficult to get the public to be enthused by it. And you can see how, particularly in an election where voters have got one vote, they can't say, well, yeah, my first choice is to remain, but I'll put up with Norway. Or my first choice is leave without a deal, but if I must, I'll take Mrs May's deal. They're having to make a single choice. And basically, during this referendum campaign, the parties that espouse one of these extremist positions have gained ground, and the parties that have been espousing compromise positions have been losing ground. I suppose behind this, of course, there is something of an irony. It perhaps would be the first time that Jeremy Corbyn it might be alleged of Jeremy Corbyn that he's cost his party votes because he decided to seek compromise and the centre ground rather than going for a more radical option. That, frankly, is one of the many paradoxes about Jeremy Corbyn, but perhaps it would certainly be rather ironic if his leadership were to be undermined because he opted for the middle ground rather than for, frankly, either of the two more extremist options.
And he'd argue as well, I suppose, for the national interest, right? So he's the Labour position is that it's not helpful for British politics for the public to be divided according to Remain and Leave.
Let me translate for you. What he means is, and this is true of both parties, at the end of the day, both the Labour and the Conservative parties are comfortable talking about what we normally call left-right issues. So the role of the state in the economy, is our society too unequal or not? What should we do about it? To what extent should the state run industries? These are the classic left-right issues. These are the issues on which the Conservative Party is largely united at one end of the spectrum, and the Labour Party is largely united at the other end of the spectrum. And that's what they would prefer to talk about. But difficulty, however, is that attitudes towards Brexit cut across the left-right divide. Those on the left were just as likely as those on the right in the electorate to vote Leave, and they were just as likely to vote Remain. It completely cuts across because Brexit is about a completely different set of values. It's about whether you're a social liberal, somebody who says, yeah, look, I'm quite happy living in a diverse, multi-ethnic, multilinguistic society. I think we should have a very open relationship with the European Union, etc., etc. Versus a social conservative says, look, no, in a society for having a degree of social cohesion needs a degree of homogeneity. Now, the Liberal Democrats are happy talking about this because they are a social liberal party. And it's always been social liberalism that's defined their core vote. And UKIP, once was and now Brexit. And by the way, many UKIP supporters are on the left politically. They are happy talking about a social conservative message. The irony, of course, of the reason why we're at, and this was always the big question that arose out of the 2017 election. The interesting thing about the 2017 election was the way in which the electorate decided to use the Conservatives to express a Leave view and tended to use the Labour Party to express a Remain view. But those who were looking at this were going, you know what, these are rather fragile coalitions and they are at risk of unravelling. Now we've hit the Brexit impasse, they've unravelled, but those tensions inside both parties reflect the fact that these parties are not united on social liberalism versus social conservatism, and so therefore, yes, at the end of the day, Jeremy Corbyn probably just wishes Brexit would go away. Richard Leonard, the Scottish Labour leader, certainly seems often to. He says the same thing about independence for Scotland.
Yeah.
This is not the crucial division, they will argue. The crucial division is between the many and the few. Well, that might be the way you would like the world to be. That the brutal truth is that for so long as Brexit dominates our politics, that is not the principal political division in our society. It's a division that's always been there. It's a division which is usually supplemented to the left-right division, but because of the prominence of this issue, it's now, left-right still matters, The Labour Party will still get voters to vote for it because they are socialists and left-wingers, even if they think, even if they voted Leave, and the Conservative Party will still get some Tory faithful centre-right voters. But this is being eroded away because of the dominance of the Brexit issue.
If there was a people's vote, who would win?
The honest answer is that nobody should be too sure of what's going to happen. Assumption number one I'm making is that basically we're going to have a choice between Remain and Leave, though doubtless it would be Leave on Mrs May's deal if there were to be a referendum very soon. That now is the direction kind of towards which the Prime Minister has edged, though I'm not sure it will ever see the light of day. On average, the polls that simply ask people the same question that was asked in June 2016, it's Remain 54, Leave 46. So it is the other way round. And to that extent, at least, you could say, indeed, perhaps we will end up with a different result. However, very few people have actually changed their minds. Amongst those people who voted in June 2016, around 85% say they would vote exactly the same way again. And crucial here to understand is that perceptions of mishandling of the process or that the government's going to get a bad deal does not dissuade Leave voters of the merit of their cause. The only thing that will dissuade Leave voters of the merit of their cause if they begin to doubt the economics of Brexit, and then you can begin to see its vote begin to be eroded. And although that group's somewhat larger, it's still relatively small. Now, within that, there are some signs in some, but not all polls, and indeed the research I've done, that maybe the Leave vote is somewhat softer than the Remain vote. But the crucial group, the group upon whom above all the Remain lead in the poll rests, are those who did not vote in June 2016, who of course are disproportionately younger voters. Back in June 2016, they were probably marginally pro-Remain. When you kind of ask them what you would have done, they were kind of somewhat more Remain than Leave, but probably not enough to overturn the result. But now they are at least, amongst those who express a view, they're about 2-1 in favour of Remain and have been for some time. So it's not so much a case of people changing their minds, but a body of people making up their minds rather late in the day, i.e. after the event. But this, of course, raises the question as to whether or not this group would, in practice, turn out to vote or not. And for example, if you look to see what they say they're going to do on Thursday, answer, for the most part, stay at home. So this is the relatively uninterested section of our population who maybe if there is a good Remain campaign and they get caught up in the very strong attachment to the Remain and Leave cause, a section of our society certainly feels that maybe as a result they will be brought to the polls. But certainly if they're not brought to the polls, very close. And therefore, basically, the quality of the campaigns, who is fighting onto which side, and what events, nearby events, are all sufficiently capable of shifting the thing in one direction or the other.
And you've been quite critical of the People's Vote campaign,
yeah.
I think. In part, sort of using selective polling, so sort of like lots of push questions where you ask the question about do you want a second referendum in the particular manner that makes people more likely to answer yes.
Yeah,
so that's being a confirmatory
yes,
ballot or a public vote as
yeah.
opposed to sort of really being honest that Remain would be on the ballot. And the second one is that they've been very open and loud about the fact that what they actually want to do is reverse the result.
Yeah. So let's take each of those in turn. One of the things that one of the things that happened to polling about the second EU referendum is that there have been Heinz 57 varieties of questions asked. But actually, you can boil them down into two groups, and there are very few of the questions that don't fall into one of these two types. Type 1 is we ask people whether or not there should be a people's vote or a public vote, and we don't make clear that Remain would be on the ballot paper. If you ask it that way, you tend to get more people in favour than against. The other type of question is to ask whether or not there should be another referendum and to make it clear that Remain would be on the ballot paper, when you tend to get rather more people against than in favour. The reason is that the first formulation is rather more attractive to Leave voters. So we go, yeah, of course we should have a public vote. We told them what to do. Yes, we should have it. And it's not obvious that Remain's going to be on the ballot paper. Ergo, you can get around 25% of Leave voters to be in favour. But the second formulation, that falls by a half. And basically, the problem, therefore, with where we are at in public opinion on a second EU referendum. I mean, insofar as, it is being portrayed by some as it were, well, let's all agree basically to send it back to the referee to decide, because the players cannot agree, they cannot sort out the penalty shootout. The trouble is that one side thinks that's a good idea and the other side don't. And if it was going to be a way of bringing the country together through a process that everybody was willing to invest in, then you'd want both Remain and Leave voters to be reasonably supportive. And they're not. It's part of the Brexit division. My criticism then is this: I think that in the early phase of the Remain campaign, I understand the tactics. You in a sense have to convince people that it's worth having a second referendum because you might get a different result, and you might well indeed think that the Labour Party is the first place where you might succeed given the character of the Labour vote. Fine, okay, but I think when it became clear that Mrs May's deal was in trouble, that then the tactics should have switched, because at that point, if you're going to increase, you've basically got 2/3 Remainers, you're not going to get many more of them. If you're going to make this a truly popular cause, you have to appeal to the Leave camp. And it's no good saying, oh, look, just go. If we were to have another referendum, people would change their minds. And, and they were all sold a pup by a message that was on the side of a battle bus. You needed to change tactics. You need to say, look, the House of Commons is standing in the way of Mrs May's deal. This is the deal that the government's negotiated in order to implement Brexit. We think that she should have the right to put her deal before the people so that we can be clear whether or not this is what the public want. The MPs are saying no, but hey guys, the original instruction came from the public. Let the public decide. But they haven't done it. The moment the people who've been clever were the two Labour MPs, Messrs Carl and Wilson, who dreamt up the idea of the confirmatory vote and who said, look, we'll let the bill through if you add a clause to say that there should be a second EU referendum. Well, Mrs May today's halfway got there. But that was much clever politics, because then you could say to Leave voters, look, actually, we're trying to make it possible for Brexit to happen. But yes, then, of course, you are going to have to make it clear that this is indeed what you want to happen. But the People's Campaign, to be honest, are too ideologically, I think, fixated on wanting to win the Remain campaign, that they've not thought about the best politics of actually getting to the point where they've got a campaign to fight.
So sort of publicly they've said what people want is a referendum to reverse the result, and then privately when they're putting out these polls, what they're asking people is, would you like a confirmatory ballot? So sort of their evidence doesn't really fit their public-facing narrative.
Well, I mean, the honest truth is the fact that the public's view on this subject is affected by question wording is an indication that this is a subject on which many members of the public don't have that strong a view. But the one thing that cries out to you from the polling, we can argue about whether more people are in favour or against or not. The thing that cries out to you from all the polling is that Remainers like it, Leavers don't. And if you want to make this a campaign whereby you're going to pursue the argument that this is the only way to resolve the Brexit impasse, then you needed to increase support amongst Leave voters. So you could actually say, look, this is what Leave voters want as well. And in that situation, you would find it much easier to persuade Tory MPs who are kind of, soft leavers to vote in favour, because they would go, well, look, yeah, okay, fine. This seems a reasonable way out of the situation. But it's not. It's become, like so much of Brexit, a politicised option that is associated with one or other of the camps.
You've been, I suppose, studying public opinion for 40 years.
Mm-hmm.
We hear a lot at the moment the idea that the public is more divided than ever, that there's sort of quite a dangerous values-based division between two halves of the country. And it's often quite a pessimistic narrative. When you look at the social attitudes survey, or when you're doing your job looking at public opinion, do you see a picture of a divided public that worries you, or do you think this case is often somewhat overstated?
I don't allow myself to be worried. I think we should get very careful about taking worry. I mean, people talk about it being a values-based I think, our politics has always been values-based. The point, as I was explaining earlier, it's a different set of values that underlies the Brexit divide. It's not that there's anything new about there being values. It reflects a different set of values. It so happens, I'm now going to get boring, but, in the 1980s, Anthony Heath, the late Sir Roger Giles, and I wrote a book called How Britain Votes. It's all there about the two dimensions of British politics, and how the Liberal Democrats tended to occupy the left the vaguely left social liberal position. The Labour Party was left, but not so socially liberal, and the Conservative Party was the kind of right socially conservative party. But the two dimensions are all there. There's nothing new about any of this, and we've long on British social attitudes been charting these things. I suppose. So the paradox, I guess, of all of this is that in many respects, if I were to pick out what has been the biggest, broadest change in British public attitudes in the last 35 years of British social attitudes, it would be that for the most part, we've become more socially liberal, not least and most obviously with respect to social mores, and in particularly what has been a very, very rapid transformation in attitudes towards same-sex relationships. But there are other areas too. We've now become more liberal on aspects of the death penalty, for example. We've become much more liberal in terms of attitudes towards those of different ethnic and other backgrounds. So all of that is a remarkable change. But then against this, we've got this apparent socially conservative concern about immigration. Now, the way that I would suggest maybe we put these two things together is that the debates about sexual mores, or indeed about those of a non-majority ethnic background who are living here, is a debate about the stock of our society. Okay, and insofar we had a debate about same-sex relationships and we then all changed our minds about it. That's a kind of one-off debate. Immigration isn't a stock, it's a flow. And perhaps one of the things we have to be aware of is, therefore, you see this with a lot of public opinion. Public opinion, if somebody's been living next door to them for 10 or 20 years, they kind of accept them. But if they're on their door and they're new, and if it happens suddenly, etc., you get much more away in the resistance. So I think one needs to be aware that, the challenge that, we have to acknowledge that this country, by its own historical standards, has been experiencing high levels of net inward migration for the last 15 to 20 years. And that has changed society for some people in a way that they find uncomfortable. And that therefore the fact that you've got this flow and this change, I think, that marks immigration out from some of the other issues on the kind of social liberal spectrum, whereas society we've become much more socially liberal, and that therefore to that extent at least it's in a somewhat different box. But that's the interesting paradox. Otherwise, the other thing that sometimes gets people exercised is that they get exercised about the fact that politics is about identity, and they kind of thought that identity had disappeared. Well, for those of us living in Scotland, there's nothing new about identity politics, and this is also, this again is about identity in the sense that in part we are talking about the legitimacy of a set of political arrangements, and that a significant section of our society doubt the legitimacy of those arrangements. Well, social psychologists will tell us that identity will always be with us, and identity always has an inherently them and us aspect to it. We should not be surprised about any of this. And at the end of the day, look, even if you're a Labour Party supporter, what you really tend to say is, I don't like people being divided between Remainers and Leavers, or between feeling English and British, or British and Scottish, or whatever, but perhaps are not so reticent about people being defined between working class and middle class, and certainly not reticent about defining between what the so-called many and the few. It's just that, as we've kind of suggested earlier, they would prefer one set of social divisions rather than another set of social divisions, because one makes them feel uncomfortable and the other is one that they're quite happy to try to develop politically.
Parking Brexit for a moment, sorry. This is probably going to be my last question. I'm going to go to the audience in a moment. How radical do you think the Labour Party can get, especially when it comes to economic policy? So for a long period of time, there was an assumption or sort of like an accepted wisdom that Labour had to seek the centre when it came to economic policy for them to win general elections.
Yeah.
Everyone saw Jeremy Corbyn as far too left-wing, as way too radical to be accepted
But
by
of
the
course he
British
wasn't.
public. And then 2017 happened and people are like, oh, wow, actually, the British public love radical left-wing policies.
No. Let's unpack 2017. Right. The principal fiscal transfer in the 2017 Labour manifesto was to tax more heavily a relatively rich section of our society in order to subsidise the lives of middle-class university students. I think very few people would regard the reality of Labour's 2017 manifesto as a radical transformation of the distribution of income wealth in our society. Point two, and again, this comes back to the paradoxes of Jeremy Corbyn and brings us back to our previous conversation. The irony of the 2017 election campaign is that Jeremy Corbyn won an electorate that Tony Blair would have died for. Because the group amongst whom Corbyn was relatively successful were the social liberals we've been talking about. There isn't any evidence that Labour's vote went up more amongst left-wingers than it did amongst those in the centre or right-wingers. It went up amongst all these groups. Where the distinction is, where Labour's vote went up more amongst social liberals than it did social conservatives. So, Tony Blair would love the Labour Party to be full of young, socially liberal, middle-class graduates. That's what it's full of. Remember now, in 2017, almost a half of university graduates in our society voted for the Labour Party. The Labour Party is at least as much now the party of the working academic as it is the party of the working class. And the social profile of the Labour Party vote is actually quite a long way away from what was the original inspiration of the party, is the party of the working man, and it was the man then back in 1900. I think let's unpack that first of all. Now, beyond that, I mean, there are then also other paradoxes going on here. Insofar as the Labour Party is in favour of a softer Brexit than is the Conservative Party, then I think the paradox is that actually it is the party of our centre-left in the UK that is more willing to defend the institutions of international financial capitalism than is our party of the centre-right. The Conservative Party has a protectionist electorate. The 2017 Tory manifesto envisaged quite substantial intervention in the market. And if Theresa May had ever been able to articulate and implement her vision, I think we would have seen a government that, this was a Tory government, not a Conservative government in Theresa May's view. This was a government that was willing to tame the market in order to achieve what it regarded as greater social cohesion. Therefore, I mean, the fun I would occasionally have when I talk to business audiences, I say, well, look, which is worse? A party that is perhaps going to deliver a hard Brexit versus a party that, it might well indeed want to nationalise a few utilities, which we all know are not terribly popular in private hands, but otherwise actually has a vision of Brexit and may not even pursue Brexit that is much closer to the vision of big business. Which poison do you prefer? Now, the interesting thing is actually, once you look, they kind of look at you and they go, oh, hang on. Particularly when you point out that actually Labour wasn't particularly radical in 2017, and they look at you and they go, oh. And what is undoubtedly true is that many in the business community struggle with that question. They still have this concern that Corbyn is going to be too left-wing. I think perhaps in particular, of course, obviously, it's the concern about the taxation of high incomes. But, the truth is that as a society, I don't want to pretend that we're dramatically, radically left-wing, but that, even the Conservative Party now is acknowledging that maybe, for example, the role of the private sector in public service has been exaggerated, and that we seem perhaps now to accept that maybe the state could perhaps be doing more than it was. And that certainly when it comes to what people regard as natural monopolies like railways, water, etc., there is a kind of feeling that maybe this should be run by the public sector. And certainly when it comes to things like schools and hospitals, again, certainly not much enthusiasm for private sector involvement. We are clearly concerned about certain aspects of the labour market, and there clearly is at least a degree of concern about at least the various highest levels of executive pay. Now, you can perfectly reasonably point out that overall net inequality is no greater now than it was in 2010 or indeed in 1997, but it did increase quite dramatically in the 1980s, and there is still a residual question there as to whether we should be trying to get back. So I think, I think certainly. The world has moved on, and simply imitating Blairism isn't necessarily going to be particularly, a lot of what Blair believed in, like, for example, involving the private sector more, the world has moved on. That we do seem to have an appetite for greater regulation, less than the financial crash, concerns about aspects of the gig economy. Now, how far you can go, another matter, but certainly I don't assume that a somewhat more left-wing message the Labour Party has at the moment, because again, one of the things I wrote, about Blair was, in fact, what happened under Blair. Blair didn't just simply follow the electorate; he actually moved the electorate, and he moved the electorate to the right in a way that Margaret Thatcher would have loved to have done but failed to do. So I think certainly, there is space there to move the public back in the opposite direction, but of course it would require good salesmanship, and above all, a sense that this is a party that knows what it's doing and will be able to deliver, etc., etc. And, you might, when it looks as though, for example, according to its critics, that its plans for nationalising utilities might mean that actually investors may not get what some might regard as fair market value, in any case, and only get government bonds, then that creates a debate and an opening which might make the thing more difficult, because, although Labour politicians are still inclined to say that, it all goes to shareholders, one of the ways in which our society has been reshaped as a result of the fact, not least encouraged by Labour governments as well as Conservative governments, that we have far more of us now have occupational pensions. Shall we say the few perhaps is somewhat more numerous than the Labour Party is sometimes inclined to portray them as.
All right, we're going to get some of your questions now. First of all, you're watching Tisky Sour. This is Novara Media. As you know, this channel is only possible because of your kind donations. If you are already a subscriber, thank you very much. If you aren't, please go to support.novaramedia.com. As you know, our ask is for the equivalent of 1 hour's wage a month, so we can continue working around the clock. As ever, please like this video. It means it appears in more people's news feeds. Share it on Facebook. Share it on Twitter. While I'm collecting these, I'm just going to ask one more of my own. I'm going to abuse the rights of the chair. I suppose what you said there is that the few might be more numerous than Labour might want it to be. Yeah. Another thing you can see when looking at, or one might suggest when taking a long view about British politics, is that what Margaret Thatcher did quite successfully was sort of expand who the few were. So who were the winners of capitalism, who owned houses, whose property prices were rising, who held a small amount of shares.
Yeah, so fewer people own houses now than did.
And now that's broken down.
Yeah,
sure. So now that Thatcherite coalition has broken down because there is no way to become part of that section of property owning society.
Well, it's become much more difficult. Yeah, sure.
And that's given us a more radically left electorate in some respects.
Well, I'm amongst those who was always extremely doubtful about the extent to which the extension of owning occupation made the electorate more right-wing in the first place. Basically, what tends to be true is that those who were able to buy their council homes in the 1980s were those who were relatively better off members of the working class, who were already relatively more likely to vote for the Conservative Party in the first place. So it may have been more of a case of the Conservative Party rewarding those who were already part of its coalition as opposed to winning new voters to its coalition.
Okay, we've got I'm going to give you the questions now. Right, so this is from Mandead. Question. So, John, how do you explain Change UK's failure to launch?
Well, a variety of things. The first is basically this election came far too rapidly for them. Secondly, I don't think any of the ladies and gentlemen concerned have any extensive experience of running a party organisation. 3, they don't have a party organisation of any note. and four, in the wake of that, a degree of confusion. And I finally, it took me a long time to realise. I finally realised, reading an interview with Chukwuemeka, that the point about those bars was they're meant to be the stripes of a tiger, because they were the tigers. But of course, they aren't the tigers anymore. Yeah. So
that's what it was.
That's what it was, apparently.
Oh my God!
But so
that's the wrong way round. The stripes of a tiger.
Well, that's probably also true. Pass. I think they didn't have the and the other thing, of course, is this is a group of people who basically left their parties, and they were pushed out, as they felt it, much more than they were pulled by the idea of creating a new party. They haven't been ready. They weren't ready. But then equally, however, it was from the very beginning perfectly obvious that they were in exactly the same position of the SDP were in 1981, which was that they were fishing in exactly the same waters as the Liberal Democrats. And I don't think any of the people involved had any particular connections with the Liberal Democrats before. They probably didn't understand the culture of the party, which is rather distinctive, etc. And they kind of thought, well, yes, we will be able to launch, and we will be able to demonstrate that we're more popular with Democrats. The Liberal Democrats will have to come and join us. Well, it's not worked out like that, because the Liberal Democrats, however weak they were in the wake of the coalition, did retain a party organisation. There is at least a man and a dog representing the Liberal Democrats everywhere in the country, from Thurso down to St Ives. And they have that organisation. They're beginning to recover their local government base. And as a result, the Liberal Democrats have an advantage. And of course, what's also true, there are plenty of voters out there who used to vote Liberal Democrat, but didn't because they were upset by the coalition. But, 9 years on, memories begin to fade.
We've got a question from Richard Seymour, friend of the show. He says, press John on what he means by left wing. So you've asserted that one, UKIP had many left-wing voters, and two, that Labour picked up no more left-wing voters than right or centre voters.
By left-wing, I mean people who, if you give them survey questions that ask them that either tap their view about the extent of inequality in society, and or ask them about whether or not the state should be doing more, for example, to reduce income differences between rich and poor. These are the people who say that society is too unequal and they think the state should do something about it. So it's about the role of the state in our society, in our economy, and in particular the extent to which the state should or should not be pursuing greater equality. And it's an argument between those who say, look, on the left, we should have a more equal society, and you can then argue, maybe some people argue that's also a more efficient society, but certainly it's more equitable, it's more morally preferable, versus those who say, no, you have to have a degree of inequality in order to create the incentives for people to go out and risk their capital in order to grow business, and then that is a process from which we all in the end profit because the economy grows more. Now, that's the classic left-right debate, and that's what I'm referring to.
I suppose a way of sort of linking that back, abusing the rights of the chair again, is I can see how that's a neat way of dividing the electorate. So you're looking at social values, social values, progressive or liberal, illiberal, and then economic values, right or left. But do you think that phrasing it like that potentially gives UKIP or the Brexit Party an easy ride? So many of our viewers would see issues about migration or immigration as a left-right issue.
Yeah, I know they would, and they're wrong. They're wrong, right? Okay, I have a fund. Because there is no. The point is that if you ask people questions about immigration and sexual mores, etc., those attitudes are not necessarily correlated with the answers that you get to questions about inequality in our society. These are not a bundle that necessarily package together. Mm-hmm. Now, I understand that for many people inside the Labour movement, yes, it does. But this is not true of our society in general. Basically, that whether you're a social liberal or a social conservative, it's orthogonal to whether or not you are left-wing or right-wing. Mm-hmm. So in other words, knowing somebody's views about how the economy should be run and their concern about inequality in society basically is a very poor predictor of their attitudes towards immigration and attitudes towards Brexit. And that's why I think it is a mistake to use the language of left and right to refer to UKIP and Brexit, and that in doing that you fail to understand the nature of the thing you're dealing with. So even if you don't like them, it is potentially misleading for you to use the wrong label, because that means you will fail to understand the basis of their support. And if you're going to compete with them effectively, above all, the thing above all you need to understand in politics, you need to understand the position of your opponents and their strengths as well as their weaknesses.
There is a way that these sort of analyses, because obviously here it's almost a methodological or semantic question as what you consider to be left or right.
Sure.
But there is a way that sometimes these classifications feed back into political arguments. So, for example, in many of the polls that are referred to in the news, or the YouGov or whatever, yes, they talk about class in terms of ABC 1s and CDEs.
Sure.
And it's about manual, non-manual.
Yes.
And what you end up with is a situation where you can have Labour MPs saying, we've abandoned the working class.
Yes.
And because of the categories that pollsters use,
yes,
you ignore people of colour who live in inner cities who work in care homes because they're not manual labourers. And
I doubt if they're able. I think they'd almost undoubtedly be personal. Well, certainly in most social class schema, they'd count as personal service workers, and they would end up being classified as probably routine or semi-routine workers.
So they would be working class.
Well, look, I mean,
it depends what you're in.
Now we're getting into the methodology
and the
measurement
right?
of social class. All right. So the pollsters use a social grade scheme. ABC 1, C2, DE. People like me who do academic work will use the government social class schema, which is essentially, for those who understand it, is rooted in Weberian sociology, okay? And it's to do with the degree of authority and autonomy you have in the workplace, and the extent to which you are exposed to the vicissitudes of the market. So routine and semi-routine workers have relatively little protection against the market. They have little authority and autonomy. People like me in university jobs tend to have a high degree of autonomy, although it's reduced in universities these days, but some of us still get away with it. High degree of autonomy, and we're very heavily protected against the immediate short-term aspects of the market. So that's the base of it. Now, and again, obviously you could just prefer a Marxist definition if you want, but basically British sociology and government statistics have hit upon Weberian sociology as a reasonable, and it is rooted in a very clear theoretical perspective.
We need to let you go soon, so I'm going to give you just one last question.
Okay.
Will milkshakes affect the outcome of the election on Thursday?
No, I think the one thing it does is it's the one thing that persuades Anna Soubry to be nice to Nigel Farage, which I suppose is quite a considerable achievement. But hopefully, to be honest, people will stop throwing milkshakes, because whatever we think of either side of people in these arguments, they should at least be allowed to talk to each other. And, I think, insofar as people like Farage engage with the public, let's go back to ensure that, therefore, the public take the opportunity to engage in old-fashioned political banter and heckling, a lost art, and an art with which many of our politicians have learned how to deal with. And insofar as Farage is accessible, that's what people should use him for. Challenge his arguments. But, the truth is, probably, if it makes any difference at all, the milkshakes probably will, if anything, will help to reinforce the determination of Mr. Farage's voters to turn out and vote for him, because they will go and say, this just goes to show what an unruly mob are the people who are opposed to us. So forget it. Stop it, guys.
I'm more relaxed about the milkshake. I mean, the one counter argument is it associates him with Tommy Robinson as someone who's outside of the political norm. But I don't know if you have much truck with that argument.
The Brexit Party is a registered political party in this country standing in a democratic election. You may not like what it's standing for, but according to the law, it has a perfect right to do so. And it seems to me, therefore, has a perfect right to express its views in exactly the same way as anybody else, including the most left-wing person in the country. And you'll like to know, we had the Brexit Party on last week. So if you want to hear all their arguments straight from the horse's mouth, you can check out Claire Fox on last week's Tisky Sour. John Curtice, thank you so much for joining us this evening. I've learnt a lot. I'm sure our audience have. Hopefully we'll have you back soon, and good luck covering the upcoming European elections. Thank you for joining us tonight on Tisky Sour. As ever, this show is only possible because of your financial support, so please go to support.novaramedia.com and become a monthly subscriber. As you know, our ask is for the equivalent of 1 hour's wage a month. Like this video, share this video, keep your comments coming. We enjoy them. Good night. See you next week.